Let's turn our attention to labor supply now. The labor supply function is a really tough one. Economists look at it as a decision by workers to choose how to use their time, either working, which gets money but is less pleasant than leisure. And the trade-offs between labor and leisure will result, at least over the long run, in worker decisions about how much labor to supply to the workforce. And you might say, oh, well, everybody that I know that's a lawyer works 60 hours a week, whatever. And it indeed is true that the occupations, when you choose your occupation, you're choosing essentially an amount of hours and a structure of work. But we change occupations fairly regularly in the United States. Not me, but a lot of people do. And you guys are at a point where you're choosing your occupation, and lifestyle choices are part of that choice, presumably. And then, of course, over time in the economy, we see a move to shorter work weeks in the U.S. as workers, through their unions, oftentimes won the right to have weekends off. In France, the voters decided to forcibly limit the work week to 35 hours some years ago. Anyway, these changes work over time. Anyway, the labor supply function is really problematic as far as making just a blanket prediction about how workers will respond to an increase or a decrease in the wage rate. And this is because there's two things going on. When wages, let's just talk through the case of wages going up. You can talk through the case of wages going down on your own to see if you understand it. Anyway, if wages go up, there's two things going on. One is the substitution effect. If we have this labor-leisure choice, and anything that's not work is called leisure, even if it's taking care of kids and cleaning your house and cooking for your family. It's a much harder job than entering the workforce, but we still call it leisure because there isn't a paycheck involved. That's a problem of GDP accounting, one of many. But so on the one hand, there's a substitution effect. If the wage rate goes up, the opportunity cost of quote unquote leisure goes up, and so you're less likely to do the more expensive thing now, which is taking time out of the workforce to do whatever. So that's the substitution effect. However, there's another effect. There's an income effect. When your wage goes up, you have more income, and you want more normal goods. And leisure is generally a normal good. So as you get richer, one of the things you might do is to choose more leisure time. So which effect's going to dominate? Well, it really depends, and it's an empirical question. It depends on each individual worker's individual situation. We do see some tendencies based on which category people fall into, but still, it's very difficult to say with much assurance that the overall labor supply curve slopes up, slopes down, is flat. It's somewhat difficult to say, especially over the long run. Anyway, let's nevertheless dive in. So the substitution effect of a wage increase, we see this working women or women with children who might work, we see a fairly high in absolute value elasticity of labor supply. That is, if wage rates go up, a lot of mothers will return to the workforce at some level. When wage rates are low, then it really is pretty tough to go to work if you have young children, and if wages are low, especially it doesn't have to be the woman that chooses to stay home, but still culturally in the United States we still see women making that choice a whole lot more than men, and the data show that women with children choose, especially during the years where their children are young, choose to go in and out of the workforce in part based on wage rates in a way that married men don't, single women, or I should say women without children don't, but these working mothers tend to be fairly responsive to wage rates for good reason. So we see wage rates go up. There's going to be higher labor force participation because of the substitution effect. Wage rates go down, lower. Now the other side of this behavior is the income effect, and the income effect cuts in the opposite direction. Now with more money, we see people choose more leisure time. And remember, leisure is everything besides participation in the formal for pay labor force. So it's not like you're sitting, not necessarily like you're sitting home, eating bonbons, watching TV. It's you're taking care of your house, your children, your aging parents, whatever. These are really hard jobs, potentially that are called leisure. But anyway, one thing we see at the very low end of the wage scale, we see low-income workers, when they get a bit of a wage, we actually see them, sometimes anyway, and we see them work less. They go down from having 3 part-time jobs maybe to 2. So they work 45 hours instead of 50, and so they can care for their children or whatever. So we see this on the very low end of the pay scale, and interestingly enough, we call this a backward bending portion of the supply curve. Wage rate goes up, the hours supplied to the workforce fall. On the other side, on the other end of the income spectrum, we see doctors and lawyers and other types of people in the later years of their career, their income. Remember, these partnerships, the partners, senior partners make money, from their own work, but also they get paid, they get a share of the work of the junior partners' earnings as well. And so in their higher income years, we see a lot of highly paid executives. We see them making choices to spend more time on the golf course, say, than in their office, or at least more time on the golf course than do junior partners. And so we see this decision on the higher end where doctors maybe go in 3 days a week instead of 5 in their later years of their career. Senior lawyers maybe somewhat the same. So it's really hard to draw the overall labor supply function. Nevertheless, if we think about just the labor supply to one occupation, and then we're thinking about workers, well, I'm going to be in the workforce, but I could be a nuclear physicist or a computer engineer or a computer programmer. Which of these occupations will I choose? Well, when we focus on the labor supply for one particular occupation, things look a little different. When I forgot I had this slide here. When the labor supply function is ultimately comes down to an empirical question. There's been some fairly interesting work on this question. I won't go into it much, but when we see labor supply functions based on wages, for married men, the labor supply function is vertical, essentially. There's zero elasticity of supply for married men. And for women without children, it's actually, I don't know whether there's more or less of them. I'm going to guess less. For labor supply function for women without children, how do I make that notation? A C with a slash through it. How's that? Anyway, that's supposed to be a C with a slash through it. We see pretty much a vertical labor supply in the peak earnings year as well. What we do see for women who have children, we see an upward sloping labor supply function. It's not it's not an elasticity of +3, but it's definitely a much greater elasticity. I think that comes out to be about close to 1, if I'm recalling these studies correctly. Backward bends, just to draw you a little picture of the backward bends. I know I don't have a slide for this. A backward bending labor supply function at the low end and the supply end and the high end for the overall labor market would look something like this. So it's that's a backward bending labor supply curve. And at very low wages, we see this inverse relationship between wages and labor, quantity of labor supplied, and at the very high end we see that. And that comes out in some of these data. Notice that just as a quick aside, that our textbook chapter 12 presents a very standard analysis of the minimum wage as a very standard analysis of a price floor. But analyzing the minimum wage that way is really problematic, especially if we're in this range of the labor supply curve. There's also some monopsony issues in low income worker markets. There might be only a single fast food restaurant that employs a high share of low wage labor in a community, or even in an agricultural community where we find a lot of low wage workers. There are tons of farms, but those farms contract out through a labor contractor for their workers, mostly immigrants, often illegal immigrants, as it turns out, and those illegal immigrants are afraid. They see it as very risky to go offer their own labor directly to these farmers, and the farmers don't want to hire those workers directly, because then they have legal liability. They have to verify whether the Social Security numbers are valid, et cetera, and it gives these labor contractors extraordinary power over these low-wage farm workers. And analyzing minimum wage, the effect of minimum wage laws via the traditional model is really sort of silly, frankly. You need a general equilibrium model. You need a model that incorporates some of these other strange characteristics of low-wage labor markets, and that traditional upward sloping supply, downward sloping demand curve, perfectly competitive model just generally doesn't cut it, in my view. So let's go back to the question of what the labor supply curve looks like for a particular occupation, and if we just think about the supply curve for computer programmer labor, well, in that case, the supply curve for one particular segment of the market is fairly sure to be upward sloping, as wages for computer programmers go up relative to wages for other things that people really good at math could do, nuclear physicists or electrical engineers, or you name it. Economists actually are pretty math intensive people, math able people, I guess I should say. Anyway, you see that there is, if we just look at one occupation, then we can talk about an upward sloping labor supply curve. And so when we go to analyze markets, if it's just for the market for computer programmers, they're generally young people, so they're not in that senior part-time worker category, and they're working for corporations, not for partnerships that give them a kickback based on the younger people's effort. So if we look at a market for a particular segment of the population, well, then our traditional looking supply and demand curve analysis works. Remember that the workers, the households, are the suppliers of labor in these labor markets. The firms employing them are the demanders of labor. If, let's say, because there's a move toward computerizing everything, and there's a proliferation of new devices that demand new apps, well, that's going to mean an increase in the demand for computer programmers, and we see employment of those workers goes up, and the wage of those workers goes up, and so on. You guys are pretty good at this kind of analysis, and I'll leave it at that.